Our next speaker is Professor Sabelo Ndlovu-Gatsheni, and I'm going to be introducing him. Maybe we can bring him up.
Hello.
Hello. I'm going to be introducing you. So again, I'm very privileged to meet you today. One of your papers is the first paper that the current class that I'm teaching reads. So again, very happy to meet you. So I'm going to read his bio to you. Professor Sabelo Ndlovu-Gatsheni is currently professor and chair of Epistemologies of the Global South, with emphasis on Africa, and the Vice Dean of Research in Africa, multiple cluster of excellence at the University of Bayreuth in Germany. He's also Professor Extraordinarius in the Department of Leadership and Transformation in the Principal and Vice Chancellor's Office at the University of South Africa. Also Professor Extraordinarius at the Center for Gender and African Studies at the University of Free State in South Africa. Also Honorary Professor in the School of Education at the University of KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa. Visiting Research Fellow at the Johannesburg Institute for Advanced Study at the University of Johannesburg, South Africa. Research Associate at the Department of Political Science at the University of Pretoria, and Research Associate in the Ferguson Center for African and Asian Studies at the Open University in the United Kingdom. Previously, Professor Ndlovu-Gatsheni worked as Research Professor and Director of Scholarship at the Department of Leadership and Transformation in the Principal and Vice Chancellor's Office at the University of South Africa. He also served as the Acting Executive Director of Change and Movement, of the Change and Movement Management Unit. He's the founding head of ACHI, Mafeji Research Institute for Applied Social Policy. He's also the founder of the African Decolonial Research Network based in the University of South Africa, and is a member of the Academy of Science of South Africa. Are you impressed yet? I'm not done. So his field of work comprises the decolonial, post-colonial theory, empire and colonialism, politics of knowledge and decolonization of higher education, Black radical tradition, Black Marxism, African history, African development, African political economy, Nguni history, and has fieldwork and archival experience in South Africa. He's also published over 100 publications, including 20 books to his name. Among his major recent publications are the following books: Decolonizing the University, Knowledge Systems and Disciplines, the Joshua Mapuko Como Zimbabwe. His next book was The Decolonial Mandela, Peace, Justice, and Political Life, and Politics of Life, Epistemic Freedom in Africa, Deprovincialization and Decolonization, and his latest publications include Decolonization Development and Knowledge in Africa. Turning Over a New Leaf is his next book, The Dynamics of Higher Education in the Global South, also another book, and The History of the Political Transition of Zimbabwe, from Robert Mugabe, and Marxism and Decolonization in the 21st Century, Living Theories and True Ideas. I wanted to do justice to his credentials, so I know that took a bit of time, but again, I'm very proud to introduce Professor Sabelo Ndlovu-Gatsheni. He's going to speak about African decolonial intellectual movements. Welcome.
Thank you, Veronica, for the for the generous introduction, and thank you so much for inviting me to speak at this conference on African epistemologies for the 21st century. I must say I share most of what my friend and the countryman, Professor Clapperton Mavunga presented. And I will try to pick one of the dimensions also, which I think is important, and which is the dimension of decolonizing knowledge in Africa. And what I will try to do is to perhaps trace the trajectories of knowledge production in Africa. Of course, it's a very vast work, and I will try to delineate it so that I'm capable of speaking about it in 35 minutes, if I'm not mistaken. I chose to speak about this because it is important that we understand that what we speak about as the epistemologies, African epistemologies, is actually a site of struggles. Is not there is a lot of fractions within and without, and it is important that we also understand it as indeed part of a struggle for self-determination. Professor Mavunga has spoken about the infrastructural aspect of it, which is also part of a struggle in which we need to be ourselves and to also self-define and self-determine the journey, the direction where we want to go. And I want to focus maybe on 3, if not 4, aspects of this trajectory of African intellectual movement, and I in the hope that we will actually capture some of the structural factors which actually limit even the innovations which we want. We also the power questions which affect our knowledge production, the institutions which also enhance and they also constrain the knowledge production, the ideologies which also and the contestations, as well as the cognitive shifts in what we are doing. And the question of colonialism, I think Mavunga spoke about somebody who said we need not to continue to blame colonialism for Africa's problems. I think what we're doing is not really to blame colonialism, but to name the cul-de-sac in which we find ourselves as a result of our historical, as a result of our history, of which Mavunga put very well in tracing it from enslavement to colonialism, the liberation struggles and others. And I think we cannot just run away from that history because it determines most of the things which are happening now and even some of the challenges. So, and we need not to think about colonialism as an event which happened in the past. It's a power structure which is continuing up to now. And as African intellectuals, we are actually immersed in most of the colonial orders of knowledge. And this is why what Mavunga's vision of infrastructural development remains a challenge, because we are immersed in these colonial orders of knowledge. We are struggling against them, but we can't actually claim easy victories that we have actually transcended them. If I can invoke also Thomas Sankara, whom Professor Mavunga invoked. And I'm here speaking about challenges of the colonial library, which continues to shape our consciousness. I'm also speaking here about what some have called the cognitive empire, imperial cognitive imperialism. And I'm thinking here about how this continues to shape the consciousness of us as doers, as thinkers. And I think it is important to always take that into account. And I want to also to start with some of the questions which actually shape our African epistemologies. The African epistemologies, they are responding to particular existential questions, if I can put it that way. And one of the key existential question which we need not to forget is that which was posed by W.E.B. Du Bois, this issue of a people who are defined as a problem. We wish not to be defined as a problem. in the modern world. The second question, which also shapes our thinking, is also this question, which will not normally be asked, which were posed by Emia Cisse: who am I? Who are we? And what are we? That question, which haunted Cisse, still continue to haunt us even in this world. Why are we not able to do what Mavunga was proposing? I think we need to understand where is this coming from. And the other question, which actually shapes the African intellectual epistemic African epistemologies, is the question of our history. A people who for a long time have been subjected to what maybe what can be called the theft of history. We still continue up to today to write ourselves back into history in various ways. And the third or the fourth question, which shapes the epistemic questions in African knowledge, is also the question which I think Mavunga exhaustively dealt with, the question of development. And I think that question still shapes much of what we are grappling with. And of course, the question of our identity is an important question, which also shape the intellectual agendas in African studies. So perhaps the first turning point, which I want to focus on, is what I called the nationalist turning point. It is an important turning point with its own problems, as most of you will know, but it is a turning point which we cannot ignore, because it responded really vigorously to the colonial interventions on the continent, not only in terms of political liberation struggles, but in the domain of knowledge, in which you will find, and I think in which you will find that it took advantage of what some historians call possibilities and constraints of the post-1945 world in order to project African power. And the issue is why is it that projection is still haunting us up to now, and they were not being successful in that projection of power? And I want to posit that we were projecting power within a context of what I will call global imperial designs, which were always going ahead of us in trying to constrain whatever initiatives we took. And I think the most representative argument of the nationalist moment in the development of African knowledge, or in the trajectory of African intellectual movements, is represented by the argument of Paul Chiambezaleza, when he says, at the center of the nationalist is the search, the nationalist turn is the search for a new African narrative, liberated from the epistemic colonization of Europe, a nationalist struggle to remake history, not within the terms of their own choosing or summoned from the pristine past, but out of the very and the continuing violent encounter with Europe. It was a struggle to subvert and transcend the imperial coding of Africa as a Hegelian black darkness, to renew and refurbish the image of Africa itself and for the world at large by an intelligentsia that was immersed in both African and the European ontological and epistemic orders. And I think it actually touches on some of the issues which the keynote speaker was speaking about. And what is important is to then say, what is it that the nationalists contributed in the advancement of the knowledge in Africa? I think it's very hard. It's a very dense and a very complicated terrain, the nationalist terrain, and it is hard to compress it quickly. I will just pick some of the highlights of the movements, intellectual movements, intellectual initiatives, which I think we need to take into account if we want to understand the trajectories of the African epistemologies. And I think we need to go back to Ghana. again, Mavunga spoke about Ghana, but I will speak about Ghana in a different way, in the sense that it is in Ghana that you find a head of state, Kwame Nkrumah, really very invested in laying the foundation of African epistemologies through the establishment of the Institute of African Studies in 1960. And in the opening of that institute, you will find Nkrumah speaking about the African genius. His speech is widely quoted, the African genius. And when Mavunga was talking about us as daring to invent the future, we can't do that without really a recovery of the African genius, which was denied by colonialism. I think it is important to say that. And in 1964, Nkrumah also hosted the first International Congress of Africanists. And the historian Kenneth Dike actually explained that when he was welcoming the delegates, I welcome you all to what I hope may prove to be a landmark in our efforts to regain our intellectual and cultural independence. And I found this to be very important because even now, we are still fighting that battle of gaining our intellectual and cultural independence. And what Mavunga was talking about in terms of infrastructures is related to this. Without that, it is very hard to actually achieve whatever we dream about these visions. And Nkrumah, speaking at that very conference, he spoke about the cultural renaissance. How do we revive the African culture in Africa? And of course, that was also the defining moment in which he invited W.E.B. Du Bois into the African continent to continue with the Encyclopedia Africana, which is one of the most important documents when we speak about the African epistemologies. And I don't want to repeat some of the things which you know, but it moves from Ghana into Kenya, into Ibadan, into Dakar, where you will see that in Kenya, what I liked most is this statement about the 1968-1969 Nairobi memo. Why can't Africa be at the center so that we can view other cultures in relationship to it? And I think everything which we are trying to do is actually to recenter Africa, which has been pushed to the margins. And then you go to Ibadan, the nationalist history was very important in coming up with the rewriting Africans back into history. But at the same time, the question of curriculum, which was posed to Clapperton, it also emerges in Ibadan, where they tried by all means to redo the curriculum. And I'm more familiar with the discipline which I come from, which is the history. And they tried by all means to change the curriculum from colonial historiography to something else. And it was within this context of the nationalist turn that you will find that even the definition of what an African university is emerges. And it emerges from the Association of African Universities in 1967. And I think that definition is still very important for us whenever we're asked, but what do you mean by an African university? And this is what they said. The truly African university must be one that draws its inspiration from its environment, not a transplanted tree, but growing from a seed that is planted and nurtured in the African soil. And I think this is the work which, when people are talking about decolonizing the universities, we are still struggling with up to now. I will move on to also that this nationalist initiative, it has its own challenges. The challenges which also have emerged as people were engaging with as the participants were engaging with the Clapperton, the issue of the elitism, that these were projects which were driven from above rather than from below. So it was driven really by the elites. and more often, the issue was not really to move radically or paradigmatically from the colonial or what Fanon termed the European game. It was more or less like fighting for inclusion in the game. And then you find that even the histories which were being written, there were more histories of big men, queens, rather than the histories of the people. And you will find also that the issues of patriarchy and the sexism were not engaged in seriously during that time. But it is a long critique which I don't want to bore you with. But whenever that critique was mounted, then there were some who then moved and they said, but what is the solution to this critique? Then they moved to embrace Marxism. And that's where you will find the Afro-Marxist emerging, more specifically concentrated at the University of Dar es Salaam in Tanzania. But what I try to do is to distill what were the issues. I think one issue which comes clearly there, you will find that in Dar es Salaam, they then deal with the socio-economic question. And this is where you will find the emergence of the dependency and the underdevelopment concepts, which up to today, I think they are important to understanding the socio-economic condition, not only of Africa, but of the global South. And that's where you find Rodney writing that book, that classical book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. And you find leading scholars like Semir Amin also writing a lot, critiquing his own discipline of economics and bringing in the issue of political economy as a better way of understanding the African situation. And the birth of so many other concepts like maldevelopment, underdevelopment, center periphery, which I think they are still very important concepts as far as I'm concerned. And you will find that there is also then shift in the Dar es Salaam school, in the sense that if Ibadan was about drum and trumpet history, then in Dar es Salaam they begin to write what they call a people's history from below. They begin to say history is not made by elites and men and the queens, the kings and the queens. They begin to say, but history is made by people, and they begin to write history, and they bring the question of class analysis into African studies in a very purposeful manner. And you'll find also that this question of curriculum in Dar es Salaam, they tried to deal with it in a very deliberate manner, in which they tried even to desegregate some of the disciplines into fields of study, and you will find the emergence of development studies emerging in that area. Of course, this is why it is interesting to always visit these debates, because you'll find that there was not always a consensus. You'll find the conservative who had no problem with what was being taught, and the radicals who wanted to change things, and the moderates who wanted also change, but not that one which is very drastical. But what also is emerging clearly from the literature now is that even if there was this move from nationalism maybe to Marxism, but the nationalist is always underpinning. So there is always complementarity between the nationalist and the Marxist, rather than more of a conflict between the two, as some people want to posit. And you will find Zeleza saying, nationalist humanism has withstood new theoretical waves that have arisen from time to time and alleged against its study foundations. More often than not, new ideas and ideologies from Marxism to dependency to feminism to the post have been incorporated into its trappings, spacious complex. But I want also to say the leftist thinking, the Marxist thinking, then manifests itself more clearly in the establishment of a new institution, the Council for the Development of Social Science, Cotesria, in 1973, which then become a home for most of the nationalists, the Marxists, and the Pan-Africanists. And it produces most of the cutting-edge literatures on the African epistemologies, such works as Manufacturing, African Studies and Crisis, 1997 by Zeleza, and his two canonical volumes on the start of Africa, 206 and 207. I think you cannot ignore that work when you want to understand African epistemologies. And I want to then shift now to to another very problematic moment in African studies, the moment of the pause. And I want to say that that shift from the nationalist and the Marxist to the post-colonial theory, you need also to background it. And one of the ways in which it was backgrounded, it was by not even by an African scholar, but by Julian Gore, who says we need to take notice of the year 1973. And then a lot of people said, what happened in 1973? Then he said in 1973, that's when Amilcar Cabral was assassinated. And he says that is a notable change because he was very active in not only in the guerrilla struggle, but also in the production of leftist knowledge and the theory. And then in 1973, again, something else happens. That is the outbreak of the Arab-Israeli war. And maybe somebody will say, but what is the purpose of that in what we're talking about? It looks like Edward Said, who then writes the book Orientalism in 1978, was observing the events of that war when he realized the Orientalization of the Arabs. And that book, as you know, is one of the canonical texts in what they call post-colonial theory. But I must also add that it was also in 1973 that the Council for the Development of Social Science was established as a premier Pan-African institution dedicated to Africa-centered knowledge, as they put it. But again, I can go on and on because it is also in this transitional period that you will find the kicking in of the neoliberal, what do they call the World Bank? It comes in and it begins to shape the higher education landscape in another direction, in which the consequence being that then the public institutions, they lose their previous value, and the private institutions begin to emerge. And you will begin also to see intellectuals losing that radical nationalist and Marxist consciousness, and they're beginning to be accommodative of what we call, what Claude Ake called knowledges of equilibrium. But what I want to focus on as I go towards the end is what Zele's attempt, the troubled encounter between the post and the African studies. And he says that troubled encounter manifested itself in terms of the ethical questions, the ideological questions, the epistemological questions, and the intellectual incongruities, as he put it. And the critique was that post-colonial theory really is watered from the springs of postmodernism, post-structuralism. And in that way, they were seen with suspicion that they were actually another package of the colonial library or Eurocentric library coming to intervene in African studies. But I'm always reading also the other thinkers in that debate, people like Paul Ahluwalia, who wrote that important book Out of Africa, whereby he broke rank with some of those who were criticizing the post and saying that the theories like Michel Foucault, theories like Derrida, theories like Sioux, Camus, who are sometimes pushed as French theories, generally they are Maghrebian theories. They were influenced more by the Algerian Revolution, which again Mavunga spoke about the Algerian Revolution. So he tried to recover them as African thinkers. And then he argues that the post-colonial theory, we need to be very careful when we critique it, because there is post-modernist post-colonial theory. There is post-structuralist post-colonial theory. And his argument is that there is also decolonial post-colonial theory. And it is important for us to take account in that. And if we do that, therefore we begin then to appreciate the works of people like Viwa Imodimbe, the invention of Africa, the idea of Africa. Controversial, and they always criticize work of Kwame Anthony Appiah, the popular work of Achille Mbembe, and even some works of Mamdani. They can actually fall within the context of decolonial, post-colonial theory, if we can. And you must remember that this generated a lot of heated debate when Achille Mbembe was still the executive secretary of Cotesria, when he was pushing that agenda, and those who were then characterized as Pan-Africanists and political economy advocates and the nationalists, they really stood their ground, and they said, no, he is bringing ideas from outside into the African academia. And you can read about that in the in the Cotesria bulletins. And also you can read about Achilles' responses to that in cultural studies. I'm forgetting that other journal where he wrote the two articles, the African modes of self-writing, and also
public
the defense.
culture.
Yeah, public culture, and also that other article in defense, the power of the force, where he was continuing that debate which started at Cotesria. But I think what we must also think about these posts is to think about what exactly did they give us. I think Mavunga said the 1990s was a very problematic in terms of the academic, but I think there is something which can be recovered from them. The idea of inventions and the ideas of Africa, I think, is important. The attempt to complexify the whole question of colonialism, that it was not a successful juggernaut which just crushed everything. There were some remnants of what is African which remained, because colonialism was not as successful as the colonialists presented. And in those corners where it was not successful, that's when African people plugged in resistance, and that's where you can recover some of the, if we can use Mignolo's idea, the border knowledges and border thinking. It also problematizes the whole question of resistance, of domination and resistance. It brings in the questions of hybridity, mimicry, and the others, which I think they cannot just be dismissed as such. And I want to then end by saying the fundamental question of today perhaps is, why is it that the decolonization question has returned in a resurgent manner? And I think we need also to engage with that question. Isaac Kamola reacted to that question by saying there are good reasons for this return. These voices are poetic yet stringent, theoretical but immediately practical to the particularities of the struggle. The horizon of these texts and arguments often contain future filled with possibilities, even if the specific outlines are not entirely discernible in the present moment. And I always like to read this together with the long-standing argument of Ndlovu-Gatsheni, of saying, throughout whatever we want to do as Africans, we need to coldly and consciously look at what imperialism has been doing to us and to our ways, to the view of ourselves in the universe. And the way Ngugi then says, when we are thinking about decolonization, we're fundamentally thinking about that search for a liberating perspective within which to see ourselves clearly in relationship to ourselves and to other selves, and indeed a quest for relevance. Because this issue of accumulation of degrees, accumulation of titles, accumulation of these professorships, but at the end of the day, there is nothing which is being produced. We need to really engage with it more carefully. Why is it like that? Why is it that a country like Zimbabwe, which is said to have the highest literacy rate but is the most problematic, it might mean that perhaps we are competent in something which is not helping us. And I think we need to think about that in a more interesting way. And to link what I've been saying with what perhaps Chakanetsa was saying, is also this issue of saying, how do we, in the Fanonian sense, how do we develop new concepts, new consciousness, and try to set afoot a new African, again, in the words of Fanon, who is defining himself or herself as a craftsman and craftswoman, one who is able to do things for himself or herself. And I think that is where we need really to concentrate the work of decolonizing. But at the same time, we cannot actually run away from these bigger questions which I was talking about. And that's why you find Africans congregating in October, as recent as October 2013, to form the Association of African Studies of Africa. So there is still a feeling that we need to research ourselves, to research the continent itself as ourselves, and to contribute to that knowledge which is actually able to propel us into a future which we want. And I want to end by saying what I was trying to do here was to try to engage with the past in such a way that we trace the trajectories of the development of the African idea of Africa, rather than a mere African, the idea of Africa, and to perhaps think about intellectual sovereignty as defined by Kwesi Pra as an essential prerequisite for what Chakanetsa was speaking about. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Professor Ndlovu-Gatsheni. And now we're open for the Q&A section. We have a good 25 minutes or so. So I'm going to field the questions. I'll read them and yes. Thanks for the talk, Professor. We cannot run away from our colonial history, since it is processual and continual in a way that resiliently shapes the African mind in the current moment. But doesn't our tireless decolonial paradigm also continue to foreground Europe and its epistemic power in our consciousness? Are African epistemologies forever tethered to the colonial past? Is there a futurist African vision of being and knowledge that finally breaks free from the epistemic shackles of Europe and asserts African knowledge possibilities that are intimately connected to concrete material structures supported by our designs and agency? That was a long question.
Yeah, I get exactly what is contained in that question. Of course, this is why some people will always criticize us and say we are repetitive. We continuously speak about one thing over and over. And the question is, what is it that we are repeating and why are we repeating it? I think that is the better question. And that repetition needs to be started, because what is the content of what is being repeated and why is being repeated? And if you get into those two questions, then you will understand the cul-de-sac within which Africans find themselves, epistemologically speaking, politically speaking, and as well as maybe socially speaking. So you'll find that, but I don't think we can also create an impression that there is no movement. There is really a good movement in terms of a lot of very good work, which is actually disconnected from colonial library and the cognitive empire. So there is that movement, but again we need to select carefully that knowledge which actually anchors and inspires an African who is able to do things for himself or herself. And I think we are at that crossroads in which we need to move really. And they say we are now aware that colonialism limited us here, but how can we move beyond that? And I think this is where such movement as Rhodes Must Fall in South Africa, they tried to take us in that direction, and they put things clearly on the table, which what must be done. Of course, in the context of South Africa, which is not an isolated context within Africa, within the world. Questions about what do we do with our own languages? Why don't we work with our own languages within the university? And they put it clearly on the table, and they put clearly the issue of curriculum, which we continuously talk about here. They put it clearly the issue of institutional cultures, which are troubling us here, which are alienating and making people feel foreign in their own spaces. And I think we are really there. This is why I always like to speak about a resurgent and insurgent decolonization, in which another generation is realizing that the cul-de-sac is here, and we need to free ourselves this way. And the question is, will we rise adequately to this challenge this time than in the 1960s? I think that's where the issue is.
Thank you. I will read the second question. Nanji is asking, says that I am concerned about the possible pathways through which African epistemologies can take their place on the global scene. Both speakers spoke about the universities, but I do not see many of them driving Africa's development the way that the Western universities do. Rather, we turn around to be guided by non-African epistemology, which is sometimes upheld by Africans. Does this not prove that Africa's intellectual sovereignty is being challenged by the actions of the Africans?
Yeah, in fact, I can't put it that way. The issue is the African whom we're talking about today is a modern subject. And as a modern subject, you need to understand how these modern subjects are produced. So they are produced within what the Latin American scholarship is actually named as coloniality or global coloniality. And because of that, the important part which we must take home is that we are aware now of this cul-de-sac which we find ourselves. The problem is a person who is not even aware of that. The awareness is the beginning, as far as I'm concerned, of liberating oneself from. You must know exactly what is it that ails you in order to get treatment. But if you don't even understand what is happening, but also the idea that when it comes to development, the issue is to revisit that very concept of development. It might actually be a dirty word on its own, the idea of development. I will always prefer maybe Marcus Garvey's idea of Negro self-improvement as a better concept, because if you listened to what Chakanetsa was saying, prior to enslavement, the moment of enslavement, Africa was self-determining and it was able to harness its resources for its own self-improvement. And then there was a hiatus in between, in which then that ability to do things for ourselves was then affected. And we needed to reconnect to that. And the Afrocentric school is always telling us to reconnect to that so that we relaunch ourselves again after this hiatus of colonialism. And I think it's possible. We need really to know that we were once able to do things for ourselves, and the colonialism, enslavement, its disabilities must not be permanent.
Thank you. I don't see any more questions. I would like to invite any of our speakers in the room to ask Professor Ndlovu-Gatsheni any question, if they have a question or a comment. We still have a few more minutes. Chakanesa, please.
Yeah, I'm not sure that I think Sabelo answered it well. We are now at a point where we really have to ask ourselves, why do we write books? Why do we research what we research? And because this idea of bibliometrics does not work for Africa. What has it produced? And we are at a point where we have now to draw the distinctions and say, Africans who are seized with their existential questions have legitimate questions to ask about Africa without having to answer to say Africans who are fascinated about studying Africa just because it's good material. Because our optics are different, our purpose is different. But also, in addition, as you saw at African Studies, the question of the ethics of studying Africa, if you are not African, is something that we need to address, to the point that some of the knowledges that have been produced have been assumed to not have consequences towards Africa. It turns out that they do at the level of, say, US policy or European policy. What do you do about that? Or to the extent where it squeezes out the African voice from being heard at universities, where non-Africans are actually in charge of determining what gets done in Africa. Is that ethical? I can't think of a stronger voice to raise these questions because they are in the moment than students, particularly graduate students. They have to demand the kind of Africa they want to be taught in order to enable them to shape the future, because they will live in that future.
Thank you. We have one more question from Esther, and I'm going to try and read that. So Esther says that she's struggling to understand what you mean by African epistemology. It seems to me that you are really focusing on the failure to use the knowledge we already have to uplift the lives of the neediest, failure to apply innovative technologies to improve infrastructure, communication, food security, sustainable employment, and other urgent social problems.
Yeah, in fact, I don't understand the question, but I think there is something there. The issue of what exactly are African epistemologies, I think it's an important aspect to engage with. If Africans are now modern subjects produced by these structures of power, what exactly is African epistemologies? Is it knowledge produced by Africans themselves for themselves? Is it a knowledge recovered from the past as indigenous knowledge? What is it? And I think if you go to Nguku Wathiongo, he says, but the fundamental question is really about the relevance of knowledge. In other words, the knowledge you can draw from so many other archives, but as long as you make it relevant to what you are trying to achieve, and then you domesticate it, and then you own it, and then you use it for your own progress. I don't think knowledges are like, they don't have a hard boundaries, so to speak. They always cross-fertilize each other. I was thinking specifically about the case of Ethiopia, which I've been interested in because of this idea that it was not colonized. And when I went into the archive, the knowledge systems, and the idea was that Ethiopians always defined their knowledge as wisdom. And they always had this idea that wisdom lies everywhere. But it is a duty of an Ethiopian to go get that wisdom, bring it into Ethiopia, not to replace what Ethiopia already has, but to enrich what Ethiopia is already having, so that it becomes richer in terms of knowledge, which fundamentally is a departure point for whatever development they want. And I wanted also to link with the Mavunga's reflections, that perhaps the other thing which we need to think about is this issue of de-academizing knowledge. The idea that knowledge really appears in academics, and I think that's what you meant when you were talking about why do we write books? Why do we hide knowledge in books? And these books, which sometimes are not read by anybody. Or why do we package the knowledge into journals, which then become even more invisible than books? So this issue of de-academizing knowledge, so that knowledge really becomes available for everyone for our own purposes, I think is an important agenda. in the decolonizing of knowledge.
We have one more question. And from Anonymous, I'm wondering if the speakers can reflect on Africans creating knowledge about societies, histories, and cultures outside of Africa. How might this fit within the future of African intellectual sovereignty and epistemology?
Yeah, I think one case of that is already happening. If you look at the initiatives which are taken by Professor Tawana Kupe at UP, and also when he was at Wits, to try to study the other world for the purposes of advancement of the African agenda. And he's established that Center for Study of the US. The major problem is also that those centers, they then become funded by the same people whom we are trying to study, and then they set the agenda of what you are going to study. So you don't study them as empire, you then study them as friends when they are not. So it always creates those problems as far as I'm concerned. But I think it's important really that we study ourselves, but we don't disconnect from the world, studying the world, because the world strategizes about Africa, about how to tap into African resources, causing all these civil wars, causing all these problems so that they take the resources for free. So it's important to study those processes. That's why it's important to study global imperial designs, for instance. It is not to run away from the realities. It is a reality because it actually affects whatever we're trying to do on the ground.
Thank you. Thank you.
I would only add that if you look at most of these companies today, the guy who is now responsible for technology and society, James Manyika, is Zimbabwean at Google.
Yeah.
Is one of several cases now of Africans in major companies that impact and do design of things we use. It's important that we impact the institutions we are at, because that is where sometimes technologies that have disadvantaged Africa and designs that have resulted in our continent being pillaged, those arguments are made there. So to the extent that I want to know things that are happening in Africa, anyone who comes to MIT, I need to know who is it, because I don't want them to get wrong information. The same one that is actually messed up the continent. So there is a reason why I think the Anonymous is absolutely right, that we Africans now are taking our knowledge of our continent to the global stage to impact global design and particularly at the point of design, because that's where the politics, all these things are defined, and we sometimes are quiet there, assuming that the United Nations General Assembly will do its job.
Thank you. We have a few more minutes, and again, I open the discussion to the speakers in the room. We don't have any more questions from the participants that are not in the webinar. So again, we have a few more minutes, and I welcome comments on both talks.
Maybe the other aspect which we did not maybe zero much on it is this thing which they call globally economy of knowledge, with its uneven intellectual division of labor. And I think maybe Anonymous is also referring to that reality, whereby there is still this idea of Africa being the site of extraction of raw data processed in Europe into models and into theories, then consumed on the continent. And I think we need also to take cognizance of that. And I think it was Pauline Untonji who then identified 13 indices of academic dependence. And I don't think we are truly free of that at the moment, because the epistemic and the political economy, they seem to have a very strong relationship. If you are weak economically, it always also affects your ability to what we call express your intellectual sovereignty. So I think we still need to grapple with that in a more direct way.
We have a new question, and I'm going to read it from Sonia. As the agenda of the webinar is to move from the focus on discussing how African epistemologies have been sidelined to doing the hard work of curating African knowledge, don't you think we tend to reserve traditional knowledge to museums rather than putting it into mainstream academia?
In fact, when I thought about what I presented, I was thinking I was actually documenting the curation of African knowledge across particular key moments in African history. When I was starting with what was happening at the African Studies in Legon in Ghana, and the Nkrumah really making a proper call that we needed to go to the music, to the proverbs, to the cultures and all that, and they make them central aspect of the curriculum, central aspect of the work. I think he was beginning to set the agenda. Whether we lost it along the way is something else, but there was a clear vision of what was supposed to be done in the curation of African knowledge.
Thank you. And
Yeah.
Go ahead, please.
Yeah, I for me, there are people who are dying in the village right after I've left, having started them or their problems.
Yeah.
And then I published a wonderful book, get tenure and title and all that stuff. What are the ethics of that? It's no longer, I think some of us have gone way past. The train has left the station regarding the question of curation. Our knowledge has been curated since the 1500s. Our bodies have been curated since the 1500s. We have, for the first time, the opportunity to, build on the fruits of independence and render that knowledge, that struggle, bear fruit as it was intended.
Yeah.
We don't have enough time. We have to do it. We have to set the tone. Otherwise, the younger generation that's coming up will not even read about the struggles that are definitive of our time, while everybody in the United States must read the American War of Independence and the Civil War.
Thank you. And just to add on to that, Sonia, I think you'll notice that some of the upcoming talks will be talking about specific things that people are doing using African knowledge or African knowledge systems.
That is one of the things that is interesting me and inspiring me. There is this Africa NXT event that's going on in Nigeria right now, where young creatives are busy turning our knowledges into products.
Yeah.
They are just tired of simply, we provide the thought leadership. They take that thought leadership and turn it into products. That's a combination I want to see.
Okay, one final question. We're going to take our final question from Leslie, and I'm going to read that. Both to Professor Mavunga and Professor Ndlovu-Gatsheni. In my writing of my yet to be submitted dissertation, I learned that the biggest hurdle I keep facing is how our cultures have always had modes of knowledge production that does not have an author, acknowledging that different realities may have an influence in the shared knowledge. I'd like to ask if it is time we reimagine how knowledge is produced at academic institutions, but infusing folklore practices to foster a different ways of producing knowledge. That's from Leslie Quinn.
You want to take it, Mavunga?
Yeah, I will say that first of all, the academic ought not to be the only place where we produce knowledge. Sometimes I find it too constricting. And I'm not very sure that the academy will change in time before my time runs out while I'm still being productive. I have seen a lot of frustrated intellectuals, I distinguish them from academics, moving out of academia to set up spaces that are vibrant, where they can draw the frustrated academics to the community to do things together. That's the kind of intellectual that I really subscribed. Because when you come down to it, this is what the likes of Fanon, Cabral, you know, everybody who I really have deep respect for ended up doing after being frustrated that this is just academic speak. We're talking to ourselves.
Thank you. We have one more question from Okoy, but we've really reached the end of our time. So Okoy, you can get in touch directly with Professor Mfunga or Professor Ndlovu-Gatsheni. And I'm going to hand over to Nora.